There's a stretch of highway in the Missouri Ozarks where locals still won't pick up hitchhikers. Not because of superstition, because of memory. In the spring of 1961, two brothers turned a 40-mile stretch of rural road into a hunting ground. They didn't use rifles. They used charm, a pickup truck, and a gallon water jug filled with gasoline. By the time the FBI arrived, the body count had climbed so high that investigators couldn't be certain they'd found everyone. Some say there are still shallow graves hidden in those hills, marked only by the wildflowers that bloom a little too green each May. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend. This is the story of George and Melvin Laisure, the Ozark Water Jug Killers, and the spring when the back roads of Missouri ran red with blood that was never supposed to be found. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Laisure brothers grew up in a part of America that the rest of the country had forgotten. The Missouri Ozarks in the 1940s was a place where poverty wasn't just economic. It was generational, embedded into the soil like the iron that turned the rivers rust-colored. George was born in 1931, Melvin 3 years later. Their father was a bootlegger who disappeared when George was 12. Their mother raised them in a two-room shack with a dirt floor and no running water, supplementing her income by taking in laundry from families only slightly less destitute than her own. By the time George was 17, he'd already been arrested twice, once for stealing chickens, once for assault. Melvin followed his older brother like a shadow, quieter but no less dangerous. Neighbors would later describe them as odd boys, the kind who skinned animals with too much enthusiasm and watched people with eyes that never quite blinked. In 1950, George joined the Army. He was discharged 18 months later under circumstances the military refused to discuss in detail, though his record contains the words behavioral issues and unsuitable for service. When he returned to Missouri, Melvin was waiting, and together they began to drift, town to town, job to job, always moving, always watching the roads. By 1961, they were living in a rental house outside West Plains, Missouri. George was 30. Melvin was 27. Neither had a criminal record that would have raised red flags, and that spring they began to kill. The stretch of Highway 63 between West Plains and Thayer, Missouri, was 43 miles of two-lane asphalt cutting through dense oak forest and limestone bluffs. In 1961, it was one of the main arteries for hitchhikers traveling between the Midwest and the South. Young men looking for work, drifters chasing rumors of factory jobs in St. Louis, veterans trying to get home. They'd stand on the shoulder with their thumbs out, trusting that someone decent would stop, that the code of the road still meant something. George and Melvin Laisure understood that trust, and they weaponized it. They drove a 1954 Chevrolet pickup, faded blue with a cracked windshield and Missouri plates. Nothing that would make you remember it. George did most of the talking. Friendly, easygoing, the kind of man who'd offer you a cigarette and ask where you were headed. Melvin sat in the middle, silent, his hands folded in his lap. They'd pick up hitchhikers in broad daylight, usually in the early afternoon when the sun was high and the road was empty. They'd drive for 10, maybe 15 miles, making small talk, establishing comfort. And then George would pull off onto one of the logging roads that spiderwebbed through the national forest. That's when they'd bring out the water jug. It was a glass gallon jug, the kind you'd use for sweet tea or lemonade at a church picnic. But the Laisure brothers kept it filled with gasoline. They'd douse their victim, usually while Melvin held them down. Then George would strike a match. Investigators would later theorize that they chose fire because it destroyed evidence. Dental records, fingerprints, anything that could lead to identification. But some of the detectives who worked the case believed it was simpler than that. They believed the brothers enjoyed watching people burn. The first body was found on April 9, 1961. by a logger who'd gone off trail to relieve himself. What he discovered wasn't immediately recognizable as human. The remains were charred beyond recognition, reduced to bone and ash in a shallow depression 20 yards from a dirt access road. The county coroner determined it was a male, probably in his 20s, dead no more than 3 days. There was no identification. No missing persons report matched the description. The death was ruled a homicide, but without a victim's name or a suspect, the investigation stalled almost immediately. 3 weeks later, they found another one, then another. By the end of May, there were 5 unidentified bodies, all discovered within a 30-mile radius, all burned, all male, all found near Highway 63. The Missouri State Highway Patrol began to suspect they had a pattern. But patterns require data, and data requires identities. These victims had none. They were ghosts, men who'd been erased from existence so thoroughly that even their deaths couldn't be confirmed. The break in the case came from a mistake, a moment of carelessness, or maybe it was something darker. Maybe George Laisure wanted to be caught. Maybe, after a certain number of kills, the secrecy becomes part of the burden. On June 3, 1961, a farmer named Howard Pickett was checking his fence line about 5 miles outside of Willow Springs when he noticed tire tracks leading into a clearing he used for burning brush. He followed them and found a scene that would visit his nightmares for the rest of his life. The ground was scorched in a rough circle about 8 feet across. In the center were the remains of a human body, still smoldering. But this time the fire hadn't finished its work. The victim's face, though badly burned, was partially intact, and near the body, discarded in the grass, was a wallet. Inside that wall, it was a driver's license belonging to a 22-year-old man named Dennis Holbrook from Little Rock, Arkansas. Holbrook had been reported missing by his mother 4 days earlier. He'd been hitchhiking north, trying to get to Kansas City where his sister lived. His mother had told police he was carrying $80 in cash, his entire savings, and wearing his father's Air Force jacket. The jacket was gone, so was the money, but the license had been overlooked, dropped, or forgotten in the rush to leave the scene. For the first time, investigators had a name, and with a name, they could build a timeline. Holbrook had last been seen on May 30th at a diner in West Plains, talking to 2 men who witnesses described as brothers, maybe. One did most of the talking. The other just stared. They left together in a blue pickup truck heading north on Highway 63. The Missouri State Highway Patrol issued a bulletin. Within 36 hours, a deputy in Oregon County radioed in. He knew that truck. He'd seen it parked outside a rental house on County Road 4420, about 12 miles west of Thayer. The house was registered to a man named George Laisure. The deputy had pulled him over 3 weeks earlier for a broken taillight, but hadn't issued a citation. He remembered George because of how calm he'd been, almost unnaturally so. And he remembered the other man in the truck, younger, silent, watching the deputy with eyes that never blinked. On June 5, 1961, at approximately 4:47 in the morning, 8 Missouri State troopers and 2 FBI agents surrounded the rental house where George and Melvin Laisure were sleeping. They came in fast, guns drawn, expecting resistance. But the brothers didn't fight. George sat up in bed, looked at the lead investigator, and said 5 words that would echo through the trial transcripts. "I figured you'd find me eventually." In the truck, parked in the yard, investigators found the gallon jug. It still smelled like gasoline. In the house, they found a shoebox containing 12 driver's licenses, none of them belonging to George or Melvin. 12 names, 12 faces, 12 families who were about to learn the worst news of their lives. But even that wasn't the full count. During interrogation, George would confess to murders the police hadn't even discovered yet, bodies buried so deep in the Ozark Hills that some of them have never been found. George Laisure confessed for 16 hours straight. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for water or food. He sat in a windowless interrogation room in the Howell County Sheriff's Office with his hands folded on a metal table, and he talked. Melvin, in a separate room, said nothing. He stared at the wall and rocked slowly back and forth, responding to questions with silence or single-word answers that revealed nothing. But George seemed almost relieved. He told investigators that the killing had started as something else. Robbery initially. They needed money, and hitchhikers were easy target. Transient, often carrying cash, unlikely to be missed immediately. The first one had been in March, he said. A man in his 40s, traveling from Tennessee to Iowa. They'd picked him up south of Kabul, driven him into the Mark Twain National Forest, and Melvin had hit him with a tire iron while George held him down. They'd taken his wallet, $43, and buried him in a ravine. George described the location precisely, and 2 days later, investigators found the remains exactly where he said they'd be. But something had changed after that first kill. George described it as a switch flipping. The second victim, a drifter in his 30s whose name George never learned, hadn't been about money. They'd picked him up on a Sunday morning, driven him to a remote spot, and George had strangled him with his bare hands while Melvin watched. There was no robbery. They left the man's wallet in his pocket. George said he did it because he wanted to see what it felt like. When asked what it felt like, he paused for a long time. Then he said, "Like I was God." That's when they started using fire. George explained it methodically, without emotion, as if he were describing how to change a tire. The gasoline accelerated decomposition and made identification nearly impossible. It also served another purpose, though George didn't admit this directly. The investigators inferred it from the way his voice changed when he talked about the flames. There was something in the act itself that satisfied him. Something primal and terrible that he couldn't or wouldn't articulate. By his own count, George claimed they'd killed 18 men between March and June of 1961. 18 in less than 4 months. Some were burned. Some were buried. 2, he said, were weighted down and thrown into the Current River near Van Buren. When investigators asked why he'd kept the driver's licenses, George shrugged. "Souvenirs," he said. "Proof that I'd done something that mattered." Melvin's role remained murky. George insisted his younger brother had participated willingly, that they were partners. But psychologists who evaluated Melvin later would describe him as severely intellectually disabled, with the cognitive function of a child. He followed George's orders without question, without understanding the full scope of what they were doing. In Melvin's mind, some experts theorized they were just playing a game that George had invented. Whether that absolved him legally was a question the courts would struggle with. Whether it absolved him morally was a question that haunted investigators for years. By the time George finished talking, it was past midnight. He'd given locations for 11 bodies. 7 were recovered within 2 weeks. The other 4 have never been found, though search teams scoured the Ozark Hills for months. Families across the Midwest began coming forward with missing persons reports that matched George's descriptions. Young men who'd vanished on Highway 63, whose last known location placed them exactly where George said he'd hunted. The confirmed victim count eventually reached 15. The suspected count went as high as 23. The trial of George and Melvin Laisure began on September 18, 1961, in the Howell County Courthouse in West Plains. The prosecution had chosen to try them first for the murder of Dennis Holbrook, the victim whose wallet had broken the case open. It was the strongest case they had. Physical evidence, eyewitness testimony placing the brothers with Holbrook hours before his death, and George's own confession, given freely and recorded on tape. The courtroom was packed. Families of the victims sat in the front rows, some clutching photographs of sons and brothers who would never come home. Reporters from St. Louis, Kansas City, and even Chicago filled the press section. This was the kind of case that captured the national imagination, not just because of the body count, but because of what it revealed about the dark spaces that existed in America's heartland. The roads where a man could disappear and never be missed. George Laisure showed no emotion throughout the proceedings. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, his expression blank. When the prosecution played the audio of his confession, describing in his own voice how they doused Dennis Holbrook with gasoline and set him on fire, George stared straight ahead, as if he were listening to someone else's story. The jury watched him with visible disgust, but also with something else, a kind of horrified fascination. Who was this man? What had broken inside him that allowed him to do these things without remorse? Melvin was different. He fidgeted constantly, rocking in his chair, making small noises under his breath. His court-appointed attorney argued that Melvin was mentally incompetent, that he had the intelligence of a 10-year-old child and had been manipulated by his older brother. A psychologist testified that Melvin didn't fully understand that the men they'd killed were actually dead, that in his mind they'd just gone away. The prosecution countered with testimony from investigators who'd interviewed Melvin after his arrest. He'd smiled, they said, when they showed him photographs of the burial sites. He'd smiled. The trial lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. George Laisure was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Melvin was found guilty but sentenced to life in prison without parole, the jury accepting that his diminished mental capacity warranted some degree of mercy, however small. George's execution was scheduled for March 1962, but George Laisure never made it to the gas chamber. In January 1962, while awaiting execution at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City, he was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide. He'd fashioned a noose from his bedsheet and hanged himself from the bars of his cell window, but there were inconsistencies, bruising on his torso that didn't match a hanging, injuries to his hands suggesting he'd fought back against something or someone. Prisoners in nearby cells reported hearing sounds of a struggle around 2 a.m., followed by silence. The warden closed the investigation quickly. Too quickly, some said. There were rumors, never proven, always whispered, that George had been killed by other inmates, men serving time for lesser crimes who saw the Ozark Water Jug Killer as something beneath even the prison hierarchy's lowest rung. Or maybe it was guards who decided that justice couldn't wait for the state's timeline. The truth died with George in that cell. Missouri officials seemed content to let it stay buried. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you speak the name or let it die in silence? Melvin Laisure lived for another 41 years in the Missouri prison system. He was transferred multiple times, first to the maximum security facility in Potosi, then to a psychiatric unit in Fulton, and finally to a medium security prison in Bonne Terre, where he died of heart failure in 2003 at the age of 69. Guards who worked with him described him as docile, childlike, obsessed with drawing pictures of trucks and birds. He never spoke about the murders when pressed by psychiatrists or parole boards, though parole was never a real possibility. He would simply say, "George told me to," as if that explained everything, as if obedience absolved him. But this story isn't really about George and Melvin Laisure. Not entirely. Because for every hour spent examining the killers, dozens of families spent years, sometimes decades, trying to understand what had happened to the men they'd lost. The victims of the Ozark Water Jug Killers weren't just statistics. They were sons, fathers, brothers. They had names and lives and people who loved them. And in many cases, those people never got real answers. Take Robert McAllister, 26 years old, from Springfield, Illinois. He'd been traveling to Texas to start a new job at an oil refinery. His wife was pregnant with their second child. He kissed her goodbye on a Thursday morning in April 1961, promised to call when he arrived, and was never heard from again. His remains were identified through dental records 3 months after George's confession, found in a shallow grave near Summersville. His daughter was born 2 weeks after his funeral. She grew up knowing her father only through photographs and the terrible story of how he died. Or James Whitfield, a 34-year-old Korean War veteran from Memphis, traveling north to visit his dying mother in Iowa. He'd survived combat, survived a POW camp, survived things that would have broken most men. But he couldn't survive a chance encounter on Highway 63. His body was one of the ones thrown into the Current River. It was never recovered. His mother died 6 months later, never knowing what had happened to her son, believing until her last breath that he might still walk through the door. Of the 15 confirmed victims, 8 were identified. 7 remain unknown, men whose families either never came forward or whose remains were too damaged to match with missing persons reports. They're buried in unmarked graves in the West Plains Municipal Cemetery, their headstones reading only unknown male, and a date. Every year on Memorial Day, someone, investigators never determined who, places fresh flowers on those graves. Yellow roses, always yellow roses. The gesture has continued for over 60 years now, long after most people have forgotten the case entirely. The families who did get answers found little comfort in them. Knowing how your son died, knowing he spent his final moments in unimaginable terror and pain, doesn't bring closure. It brings nightmares. It brings guilt, irrational but consuming, about the decision to let him hitchhike, about not offering to drive him, about the 1,000 small choices that led to him standing on that particular stretch of road on that particular day. Several family members developed severe depression. 2 committed suicide. The trauma rippled outward like a stone thrown into still water, touching people who never even met the victims but who carried the weight of proximity to such evil. And then, there's the question that haunts everyone who studies this case. How many others were there? George confessed to 18. 15 were confirmed. But investigators found evidence, witness reports, suspicious disappearances, unidentified remains discovered years later, suggesting the number could be higher. Some estimates put it as high as 30. We'll never know for certain. The Ozark Hills keep their secrets well. Drive Highway 63 through the Missouri Ozarks today, and you'd never know what happened there. The road has been widened and repaved. The dense forests have been thinned by logging operations. Strip malls and gas stations have sprouted up in places that were once empty wilderness. Progress has a way of erasing history, of paving over the places where terrible things occurred until even the land itself forgets. But the people remember, or at least some of them do. In the small towns along that route, West Plains, Willow Springs, Thayer, Kabul, there are elderly residents who still refuse to pick up hitchhikers. Not because hitchhiking is dangerous in general, but because they remember the spring of 1961. They remember when the state police came through asking questions. They remember the search parties combing the woods. They remember the funerals, so many funerals, and the way the whole region seemed to hold its breath, waiting to find out if there were more bodies, more victims, more families about to be destroyed. The case changed how law enforcement handled serial murder investigations in rural areas. Before the Laisure brothers, there was no coordinated system for tracking transient victims across state lines. Hitchhikers who disappeared were often written off as drifters who'd simply moved on. The Ozark Water Jug Killings demonstrated how easily predators could exploit that gap. How many people could die before anyone even realized a pattern existed. The investigation led to the creation of better communication networks between state police agencies, and eventually contributed to the development of the FBI Violent Criminal Apprehension Program decades later. But perhaps the most lasting impact is psychological. The case tapped into a deep primal fear. The fear of the stranger, the fear of the open road, the fear that the person offering help might be the person who wants to hurt you most. It shattered the myth of rural innocence, the idea that evil was something that happened in cities, in dark alleys, in places far from the wholesome American heartland. George and Melvin Laisure proved that evil could grow anywhere, even in a two-room shack with a dirt floor, even in boys who skinned rabbits and watched people with eyes that didn't blink. There's a historical marker now, erected in 2015, at a rest stop off Highway 63 near West Plains. It's small, easy to miss if you're not looking for it. The plaque reads, "In memory of the victims of highway violence, 1961. May they rest in peace, and may we never forget." It doesn't mention the Laisure brothers by name. It doesn't describe what happened. It's deliberately vague, sanitized, the kind of memorial that acknowledges tragedy without forcing people to confront its full horror. Local officials debated for years whether to put it up at all. Some argued that memorializing the victims meant keeping the killer's story alive. Others believed that forgetting the dead a second time was worse than remembering how they died. The families of the victims are mostly gone now. The mothers and fathers who buried their sons have passed away. The siblings have grown old. The children born after the murders, like Robert McAllister's daughter, are in their 60s now, carrying stories they inherited rather than lived. In another generation, there will be no one left with a direct connection to the case. It will become pure history, something people read about in books or watch videos about on YouTube, distant and abstract and stripped of its human weight. But the road remains. Highway 63 still cuts through those hills, still carries travelers north and south through the heart of the Ozarks. And on certain nights, when the fog rolls in thick and the moon is hidden behind clouds, locals say the road feels different, heavier somehow, as if the asphalt itself remembers what it witnessed, as if the trees along the shoulder are still keeping watch, still holding the secrets of the men who disappeared into those woods and never came back. The Ozark Water Jug Killers are gone. George dead in his cell under suspicious circumstances. Melvin buried in a prison cemetery under a marker that lists only his number, not his name. But the darkness they unleashed, the fear, the grief, the knowledge that such evil can exist in ordinary men, that darkness never fully disappears. It settles into the soil. It seeps into the groundwater. It becomes part of the landscape, and on quiet stretches of Highway 63, when you see someone standing on the shoulder with their thumb out, you'll understand why nobody stops anymore. Not because they're cruel, not because they don't care, but because they remember, or their parents remembered, or their grandparents remembered, and memory, unlike men, doesn't die easily. Some roads carry more than traffic. Some roads carry ghosts.